Hi there, my name is Will and welcome back to another deep dive of workflow components. Today we're going to be talking about execution states and how these can help you understand where your flow is during its execution. Each Kestra execution can transition through a number of different states during its life cycle. The diagram here will help illustrate what happens. If you want to learn a bit more about executions themselves, we do have a separate video on that I'd recommend checking out. Let's walk through these different states and how you may encounter them during your executions. Here I have a number of different workflow examples, and these will all produce a various number of states that will be helpful in executing our flows. Now, to begin with, the first state that we'll get is created. This will pop up very quickly because it will happen just as the flow is executed before it then turns onto a running state. So I'm going to try and replicate that so you can see what that will look like. Here, when I press execute and go straight to overview, we might have seen that it said created, but it goes straight to the running status, which is our next status. This just shows that the flow is currently running as planned. And once it finishes, we will get a success state to show that it was successful in executing. There is also a queued one. In this case, I'm using the concurrency property here to basically only allow one of these flows to execute at the same time. So if I execute this twice, we'll see that the second one is given the queue state, which basically means that it will only execute after the first one has finished. And we can see that now that first one has finished, it is now executing the second one. There is also a warning state. This is useful for when an error may have occurred, but your flow was able to continue executing. A good example of this would be using the allow failure property. We did a separate video on that if you want to learn more. But if this specific task fails, it will leave it with a warning tag and leave the final flow state as warning to let us know that something didn't happen as expected. Let me see what that looks like. And as we can see here, we can see that the allow failure has been set because there was an error code, and we can see that the final execution state was set to warning. So there we can see that the warning example was set to warning. There's also a failed state for when a task does failed. When we can click execute here, this example is going to cause the task to fail, and because it failed without any additional properties, the whole workflow fails as well. There's also a retrying one. Here in this example, we are going to use the retry property at the flow level to basically say that when a task fails, to retry the previous task instead of creating a separate execution. So what we'll see is when we execute this, we'll see that it says it's running. It will then say it will be retrying, then it will say it's running again, and then it will say it's failed. However, there is a separate state here for if we, instead of asking it to rerun the same execution, we can instead create a separate execution, which is useful if you want to be able to separate the errors so you can see them separately. So here, if I go to the retried one, it's the same example, but here the behavior is set to create new execution. So when I execute this, we'll see that it's running, and then it says retried. And if I now go to the execution logs, we'll see that we have a separate task for retried example that has independently failed. And if we actually go to that execution, we can actually see the parent execution is in fact the previous one that it was set to retried. So useful for being able to link back and figure out what actually caused this to execute in the first place. We've also got a pause state. With the pause task, we can actually pause an execution. This is useful if you want to do human in the loop integration, where maybe you want to be able to have the task resumed manually. Here, if I click execute, we'll see that the task does go to running, and then it will go to paused, and it will not resume until I press the resume button here, where it will ask if I want to resume this execution. There's also the restarted property. So here I can go to a failed flow, and if I look at the execution where it failed, there's a restart property here. And if I press this, we'll see that it says restarted, and then it's running again. We can also get an cancelled state. So here we're using the concurrency behavior again, and then here, instead of queuing up that separate execution so that the flows run back to back, instead it's going to straight up cancel any additional flows that don't meet the limit. So here the first one will run no problem, but when I run a separate one, we'll see that that is separately cancelled because we already had one executing. So here I can see that if I go to the execution logs, that first one is still executing, but the second one was immediately cancelled. We can also kill a task. So if I go to the cancelled example here, where it's going to sleep for 10 seconds, if I execute this and go over to overview, I have the option to kill this execution, and it will say killing, and then it will say killed once it has successfully finished. The difference between the two is that cancelled meant that the flow never started in the first place, whereas killing means a command has been sent to the executor to tell it to stop executing this task, and it will then begin to shut it down, and then it will finish by putting a killed state to just verify that everything was completed there. Hopefully that gives you a bit more of an overview on all the different states that you can find inside of Kestra. This will make executing your flows a little bit easier to understand exactly what is going on. Let us know in the comments what you think and how these states are going to help you with your automations, and join our Slack community where you can discuss with us further.